You tell yourself you will start after one more video, then one more scroll, then one more snack. 3 hours vanish, and the task you were dreading is still sitting there, untouched, staring back at you like it never left. You feel guilty, but part of you also feels relieved. Researchers who study this exact moment have found that the relief is not an accident. It is your brain working exactly as designed, and understanding the actual science behind it changes how you see yourself. Procrastination researcher Piers Steel spent years reviewing hundreds of studies on this behavior. This research comes from Piers Steel, a professor at the University of Calgary, who has spent his career studying the psychology of procrastination. And his conclusion surprised a lot of people. Procrastination is not a time management problem. It is an emotion regulation problem. You are not failing to plan your day. You are trying to escape a negative feeling attached to a task. And the escape just happens to look like Netflix or a clean kitchen. This lines up with work from psychologist Tim Pychyl at Carleton University. This idea comes from Tim Pychyl, a psychologist at Carleton University who researches procrastination through what he calls the fear response, who studies procrastination through what is called the fear response. His research shows that when people face a task tied to uncertainty, difficulty, or judgment, the brain treats it less like a to-do list item and more like a threat. Brain imaging studies have backed this up, showing heightened activity in the amygdala, the same region responsible for detecting danger when people looked at tasks they had been avoiding. To that part of the brain, a hard email and a physical threat trigger a strikingly similar alarm. Here is where the reward system takes over. Every time you avoid the hard task and reach for something easier, your brain releases a small amount of dopamine, not because scrolling is inherently enjoyable, but because escaping discomfort itself is rewarding. This is basic reinforcement learning, the same mechanism behind almost every habit you have, which means every time you procrastinate, your brain is not witnessing a failure of discipline. It is recording a successful escape, and a brain that gets rewarded for an action will look for a reason to repeat it. This explains a pattern cycle documented directly. Procrastination tends to get worse as a task becomes more personally significant. A small task barely registers as threatening, so people do it without much resistance. But a task tied to your income, your grades, or someone's judgment of you sends a much louder signal to the amygdala. The stakes feel higher, so the alarm gets louder, so the pull toward escape gets stronger. That is exactly why people can clean an entire kitchen before starting an assignment that actually matters. The cleaning is not procrastination in disguise. It is the brain choosing the task with zero emotional threat over the one that feels dangerous. There is also a timing effect that behavioral economists have measured directly, called temporal discounting. Studies going back decades, including work by economist George Ainslie. This comes from economist George Ainslie, whose work on temporal discounting explains why immediate rewards feel more powerful than future ones. Show that humans consistently value an immediate reward over a larger reward that arrives later. Even when the math clearly favors waiting, relief right now feels real and available. The cost of procrastination, the rushed work, the sleepless night before a deadline, lives in the future, and the future consistently gets undervalued by the brain making the decision in the present. So the guaranteed dopamine of right now beats the abstract cost of later, unless something actively interrupts that pattern. This is where a study led by psychologist Fuschia Sirois becomes important. This research comes from Fuschia Sirois, a psychologist at Durham University who has studied the link between procrastination, guilt, and self-forgiveness. Because it explains why procrastination often gets worse over time instead of better. Sirois and her colleagues found that procrastination is closely linked to guilt, and that guilt does not just sit there quietly. It compounds. You avoid the task, you feel short-term relief, but that relief converts into guilt because the task is still unfinished and now growing heavier in your mind. That guilt raises anxiety about the task specifically. Increased anxiety makes the task feel even more threatening the next time you look at it, which triggers a louder amygdala response, which increases the urge to escape again. Sirois' research describes this as a self-perpetuating cycle, one that requires less activation energy each time it repeats, because the brain has now practiced the pattern and gotten faster at running it. This is also why willpower alone rarely solves procrastination, and there is research behind that too. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's work on what he called ego depletion. This comes from psychologist Roy Baumeister, whose research on ego depletion shows why willpower runs out over the course of a day. Showed that self-control functions more like a limited resource than a fixed trait, one that gets used up through the small decisions and stresses of an ordinary day. So by the time you sit down to face the task you have been avoiding, you are fighting an emotional alarm system using a tool that is already running low. That is not weak character. That is depleted capacity. And it happens to almost everyone by the evening. So what does the research say actually breaks the loop? Not motivation, because Cycle's studies show motivation typically follows action rather than preceding it. The evidence points toward lowering the emotional threat of the task itself, because the moment the amygdala stops sounding the alarm, the urge to escape loses its trigger. The first evidence-backed shift is task shrinking. The amygdala is not reacting to the whole project. It is reacting to how large and undefined the task feels in the moment. Behavioral studies on task initiation show that reducing a task to its smallest physical action, opening the document, putting on your shoes, lowers the perceived threat enough that the alarm never fully activates. Once started, momentum studies show people are significantly more likely to continue than to stop. The second shift is closing the gap between decision and action. The longer someone sits with a task before beginning, the more time the brain has to simulate every difficult part of it, which raises the threat signal further. This is consistent with research on implementation intentions by psychologist Peter Gallwitzer. This comes from psychologist Peter Gallwitzer, whose research on implementation intentions shows why deciding the exact moment you'll start makes such a difference, which found that people who pre-decide the exact moment and place, they will start a task, follow through significantly more often than people who rely on simply feeling ready. The third shift is environmental design. Research on self-control consistently shows that removing a competing reward works better than resisting it. If your phone sits within reach, the brain will almost always choose its guaranteed dopamine over the uncertain effort of the harder task. Physically separating yourself from the distraction does not require willpower. It simply removes the competition, so the hard task becomes the easiest available option in the room. The fourth shift is the one people least expect, and it comes directly from Sirois' research on self-forgiveness. Her studies found that students who forgave themselves for procrastinating on an exam procrastinated less on the next one, while students who stayed critical of themselves procrastinated more. The explanation is straightforward once you see the mechanism. Guilt raises anxiety, and anxiety is the exact fuel driving the avoidance loop in the first place. Self-criticism does not build discipline. It adds another layer of threat to a task that already felt threatening. None of this makes procrastination comfortable to admit. But the research is consistent across multiple labs and multiple decades. What looks like laziness is a protection system, reacting to a threat that was never actually dangerous. The task you have been avoiding is exactly as hard as it was 5 minutes ago. What has changed is that now you know the mechanism behind the avoidance, and that knowledge is usually the first thing that has to shift before the pattern finally does. Why procrastination is not a discipline problem. It's a threat response, not laziness. Guilt makes the cycle worse, not better. Shrink the task. Close the gap. Remove the phone. Forgive yourself. Subscribe for evidence-based learning. Write your comments on what you learned about procrastination.